you on all the law at one time. So what we are going to do is we're going to change it, and at this time you're going to hear closing arguments and then the law in the case. So Mr. Michael.
There is no dispute in this case that the negligence of those 4 doctors caused harm. And when defense counsel stood before you yesterday, they said another statement that there should be no dispute about it. He admitted, and these are the exact words, that no one is going to dispute that this family suffered an enormous loss. But then he went somewhere further. But this family has succeeded in moving on with their lives. This family has succeeded in moving on with their lives. Lilia Torres lost her life to the negligence of those 4 doctors. She certainly has not moved on with her life. Rodolfo lost the love of his life because 4 doctors failed to use reasonable care. Carla, Octavio, and Estrella lost the most important person in their lives because 4 doctors failed to do what a reasonably careful physician would do under the circumstances. And Lillian was cheated out of ever meeting the woman who gave her life because 4 doctors treated her in a manner which was neither acceptable nor appropriate. That's what negligence means. The negligent acts of those doctors have haunted this family for the past 1,366 days. That's every single day that little Lillian has been on this earth, and they never get a break from that. In opening statement, defense counsel also said the deepest impact was shortly after Lilia's passing. And of course, those moments were incredibly shocking. But the evidence shows that the impact of these doctors' negligence is present in this family every single day. Every day when Octavio and Estrella come home to a dark, empty house with no music on, the doctor's negligence is right there with them. Every day when Rodolfo pulls up to that house and sits in that car trying to stave off reality for a few minutes, that negligence is right there with him. Every time that Carla looks at her own baby and wishes that she could call her mom for advice, the doctor's negligence is right there with her. And every time that little Lillian, newborn baby Lillian, woke up in the middle of the night needing a bottle and found herself in the arms of her tired, exhausted dad, the doctor's negligence was right there with them. Moving on, this family will never move on. They have no choice but to accept that they will never get back what these doctors took from them. They have no choice but accepting that their wonderful wife and their wonderful mother is never coming back. But they did have choices to make. They could either fall apart or fight to put one foot in front of the other. Rodolfo, who was still a young man himself, made a choice to never quit on those 3 kids that he fell in love with, and to never quit on that newborn baby. Through this all, Rodolfo made a choice to honor the commitment that he made to his wife. The kids made a choice to continue to try to make mom proud, even though she's not here anymore. But it doesn't mean that they don't carry this horrific loss with them every single day. This family hasn't moved on. You could argue in some ways that they haven't even begun to deal with July 22nd, 2015 yet, because life never stopped. They were never given the room that they needed to grieve. There was a baby to raise who needed things to be as normal as possible. There were bills to pay, and the world wouldn't stop to give this family time to try to make sense of it all. There were 3 kids who now have no biological parents left in their lives. Those kids were forced to learn life's most brutal lessons way too young. The finality of death. And this wasn't an expected death or a timely death. This was a wrongful death. A death caused by the negligence of 4 doctors. And through that all, there was Rodolfo, just 30 years old, dealing with his own grief and dealing with his own pain, who made a promise to himself and to his deceased wife that he was going to do everything he could to try to give these children the best life possible. He felt that he owed it to her. She was the first person who had ever cared about him. She showed him what family meant in ways that his own parents hadn't. She was the first person to ever celebrate him. It's no wonder that her clothes still hang in their closet and that perfume still sits in the nightstand. And it's no wonder that he has never failed those children. You know, it's almost too hard to think about what this family went through in whiplash succession in July of 2015. From the excitement of a new baby, to the anxiety of wondering what was going on with mom, to this. You know, against the odds, Lilia Torres had created a perfect little world. This lady of limited means had raised 3 kids and instilled each one of them with love and with confidence. She was the kind of kid who left each kid feeling absolutely certain that they were mom's favorite. She gave her children these little pearls of wisdom. Make a success of yourself. Make your passion your paycheck. You don't have to like school, but you have to work hard. You're going to fall down, and when you do, get up and wipe yourself off. You know, the children remember the funny little anecdotes, like Octavio talking about accidentally selling the lawnmower. But if you listen to the children, what they miss most is who mom was. They miss the feelings that she gave them. And what was she in their life? She was hugs. She was food. She was a soothing voice. She was music, and she was dancing even when cleaning the house. And then somehow they found Rodolfo. This young man who hadn't had an easy life, but who was just fun to be around. He was hardworking. He was loving. And he fell for Lilia. He wasn't hesitant because she had kids. Instead, he fell in love with her kids. And he fell in love with the way that she loved her own children. He fell in love with them, and the feeling was mutual. They weren't going to waste their time being skeptical of this man who had their mom smiling in a way that they hadn't seen in a long time. He was good to them, and they fell in love with him back. You know, for Octavio, and for Carla, who never had a father, he became first a father figure, and then he became dad. He adopted Octavio. He was in the process of adopting Carla and Estrella. Against the odds, they created this idyllic little family. Rodolfo would spend his days working as a roofer, and Lilia would raise the kids. She was up at the crack of dawn to make them breakfast and drive them to school. She was there to pick them up at the end of the day. She was there to drive them to their games and their practices. And as you heard, she was the mother who was standing on the sideline cheering the loudest for her child. The house that they all shared was full of life and love, the smell of food, the sound of music, the joy of laughter. They'd wait for Rodolfo to get home, and they'd eat dinner together as a family. But as you also heard, it wasn't all fun and games. Lilia insisted that her kids work hard at school so that they could succeed. Lilia passed on her faith to her children, driving them to church every Sunday morning as they prepared to take communion, and beaming with pride as they accomplished their goals. And then came that news in late 2014 that mom was pregnant. The family was growing. The kids were excited. Rodolfo was thrilled. And as we heard, it was a happy pregnancy. Lilia wanted to fast forward 9 months so she could just meet the baby already. Lilia never got to meet that baby. Lilia never got to meet the mother who carried her for 9 months. She never got one kiss from her mother, and she never will. Not one caress, not one hug. She never got to hear her voice. She never got to see her smile. She never got to taste her food. She never got to see her dance. That little baby, Delesa, who became Lillian in the most tragic of circumstances, got cheated out of ever meeting her mother, who was, above all, a mother. You know, you can imagine the excitement in that house the night before Lilia left for the hospital as the family gathered around painting her stomach, because that's what her little girl wanted to do. Their last night before a new baby was coming home turned out to just be their last night. These little kids were so excited to meet their little sister, and Mom and Dad left for the hospital. They were supposed to come home with a baby, but instead they came home without Mom. And all of that excitement turned to anxiety, and then to this unspeakable grief and sorrow and loss in an instant. The juxtaposition of going from that excitement to this pain is startling. And it rocked these kids to the core, and it certainly rocked Rodolfo to the core. But life never stopped. The world didn't stop spinning to allow Rodolfo and Carla and Octavio and Estrella a chance to breathe. Little Lillian needed love. She needed care. This sweet, innocent baby came back to her house a few days later, and she had no idea what was supposed to be in there. Her scared 30-year-old father, who had never raised an infant, now had to do it alone. And you heard the testimony about how he dreaded walking in that house because once he did, he couldn't pretend that everything was normal. So what did Rodolfo do? He walked in. And he made a commitment that instead of giving up on his baby, he'd try to be Mom and Dad. Instead of giving up on the 3 older kids that he fell in love with, he'd never let them down. Think of Rodolfo's life, both then and now. He spends his days up on roofs in the hot South Florida sun. And then he came home to 3 kids who were so scared to lose him that if he was a minute late, they would call him just to check on him. After that long day, he'd get in the house, he'd make them dinner, and he'd get them ready for bed. And no matter how exhausted he was, his second job had to start. He then spent the night being the only one there with a newborn and an infant, waking up every time she cried or needed a bottle or a diaper change or just needed to be rocked to sleep. And the next morning, he got up and did it all over again. These little children have fought through their pain and their grief to honor their mother and because of their father. But it doesn't mean that every day isn't a battle. They haven't moved on. They haven't gotten over it, and they never will. But they've honored their commitment to Lilia. Let's remember who the doctors or who the defendants are in this case. The defendants are 4 doctors in a corporation who admit that they were negligent and that they failed to use reasonable care, and that their failure to use reasonable care caused this death. Their failure to use reasonable care caused all of this pain and suffering. It's the reason why little Lillian was born an orphan. Their failure to use reasonable care is the reason why Carla left home and why Octavio goes in his room and buries his head in his pillow crying. It's the reason why Estrella is dreading her own quinceañera and why Rodolfo no longer has the love of his life. And yet, what's the defendant's position? The defendant's position is that this family's grief would somehow be greater if they hadn't worked so hard to honor their commitment to this woman who they all love and they all miss every single day. To say that this family is a special family is an understatement. When Octavio cried on the stand, he was talking about his sisters. When Estrella cried on the stand, she was talking about Rodolfo. Excuse me for a second. When Rodolfo cried on the stand, he was talking about little Lillian and what she says to him when he gets sick. Every single one of them tries to be strong, but they all cry for each other. To say that Rodolfo is unique is also an understatement. There's not many men like him on the face of the earth. It would have been so much easier to give the baby to grandma, to quit on those 3 kids, but that's not who Rodolfo is. The defense counsel stood up in opening and he said that this case is unusual. And to say that this case is unusual is also certainly an understatement. This is what negligence is. And when Her Honor gives you the jury instruction, when she reads it in a few minutes and gives it to you to take back to the jury room, negligence will be defined. Negligence is the failure to use reasonable care. The level of care, skill, and acceptable treatment, which is recognized as acceptable and appropriate by similar and reasonably careful physicians. When the doctors are admitting negligence, that's what they're admitting to. And they're admitting that their negligence caused Lilia's death. These doctors admit that the hell that this family has gone through for the past 1,366 days is their fault. They did it. Their negligence caused this, and they admit that. But they're asking you to look past that, to look past their negligence because Rodolfo didn't abandon his family. They're asking you to minimize this family's grief because Rodolfo did a remarkable job with Lillian. They want you to believe that the kids have moved on because they haven't given up on life and still strive to make their mother proud. But that's not what the law says. This is another jury instruction that you're going to get, and it's something that we talked about all the way back in jury selection and throughout this trial. In determining the damages to be awarded for Lilia Torres' surviving spouse and children, you shall consider certain elements of damage for which there is no exact standard for fixing the compensation. That's a decision how to fix that compensation that the jury has to come to by looking at the evidence. We heard Mr. Carciapolo talking about the part of the jury instructions which say that that compensation has to be fair and adequate, but it says a little bit more than that. The compensation needs to be fair and just in light of the evidence regarding the following elements. For Rodolfo, the loss of his wife's companionship and protection, and his mental pain and suffering as the result of his wife's death. The jury instruction anticipates that this grief will last a lifetime. It tells you that you can consider the joint life expectancy together with the other evidence that you received in this case. For the children, their loss of parental companionship, instruction, and guidance, and their mental pain and suffering as a result of losing their mom. That's what you as a jury are going to have to do back in the jury room. As we've heard, the instructions also say, don't let bias, sympathy, prejudice, public opinion, or any other sentiment influence your decision. And there's one thing that I want to make abundantly clear. This family is not asking for sympathy. This family is asking for justice. And they're asking for justice based on the undisputed evidence that you've heard about in this case, about the type of wife that Lilia was, and about the type of mother she was, and of what these doctors took from her husband and children. While you as the jury can't be swayed by your sympathy, you have to consider their mental pain and suffering. That's the exact thing that you all will have to evaluate. I think everybody knew this after jury selection, but assessing wrongful death damages is probably the hardest thing that a jury has to do. But you all can do it. And in doing so, you're going to have to look at that pain and suffering, both in the past and the future, for each of these 5 claims. Now, opening statements was just yesterday. Sometimes 2 days in trial can feel like 2 weeks in the normal world. But since then, you all have had a chance to meet the family and to see their photos and to understand who they were and what they're all about. The words that Mr. Harwin spoke yesterday are just as true today. How do you evaluate the pain and suffering of Rodolfo, who lost his wife, who lost his life's partner? A quiet, hardworking man who loved his wife and loved her children as if they were his own. He had a partner who took care of his home during those long days when he was working as a roofer. And now he has to be mom and dad to 4 children. He's a man who's in terrible grief but needs to be strong for everybody else. You know, in today's world, we've all become a little bit desensitized. Every night you can turn on Channel 7 and see 1 or 2 minute clips about horrible things that happen. But for the Torres family, this is their reality. They can't turn this off. Their mother was taken from them through someone else's negligence, and they have to figure out how to live the rest of their lives without it. As to each of the people who have a claim in this case, as to each of the survivors, these are the questions you're going to answer. You're going to have to answer. What is the amount of damages sustained by Rodolfo Vargas Chavez for the loss of his wife's companionship and protection and his pain and suffering? As the jury instructions state, this is exclusively your job to determine how to fairly and justly compensate Rodolfo for his mental pain and suffering, for the loss of his wife's companionship, for the loss of his wife's protection as a result of her wrongful death. I'm going to suggest what I think is reasonable under these circumstances and based on this evidence. Now, you might think that my suggestion is too high, and you might think that my suggestion is too low. For Rodolfo, in the past, I would ask you to consider a verdict of $5 million. And I want to take a look back at the evidence that we have to consider. Now, the defense wants to point out that Rodolfo and Lilia hadn't been married that long. But you've heard the evidence of their relationship. And Rodolfo has proven his commitment to Lilia and to her children every single day of his life through his actions. So for Rodolfo, where does that pain and suffering start? It starts after his little baby is born. And he thinks everything's okay, and he goes to the nursery to be with his baby. Then he goes back to the recovery room where he was told that his wife was going to be, but she's not there and nobody can give him an answer. And he goes back to the nursery and back to the recovery room. And the joy of the new baby is starting to mix with anxiety. And as he's walking down the hall, he sees a group of doctors coming. And one of them moves out of the way and there's a stretcher, and he sees his wife on that stretcher. And he asks, what happened? What's going on? And the answer he gets is, who are you? You have to consider those moments when he's texting pictures of the baby to Carla and Octavio and Estrella, but goes silent every time they ask about mom because he doesn't know what to tell them. We have to look at the next day in the hospital when he tells his kids that he's going downstairs to get his hat, when he really just needs a private place to go and cry. We need to consider those moments when Lilia squeezed his hand and he realized that he was never again going to touch the woman who taught him what family means. And then we have to look at every day since. When Rodolfo first crossed the threshold of that home with the baby, scared and grief-stricken, he decided that he was never going to quit on those children. We have to consider those nights when Rodolfo, having never had a chance to grieve himself, exhausted from work, raising those kids, was awake and feeding his newborn a bottle because there was no one there to help. We have to consider how he felt at Lillian's baptism, looking around at all the other kids who had two parents but trying to smile because he knew that's what his daughter needed. What Rodolfo has done through his pain has been exceptional. It's taken his toll. You know, we've heard about how he used to be so fun and always a good time, and obviously he's had to grow up. He's become a lot more serious, but he's honored his commitment to his wife. For the future, I'd suggest an additional $5 million in compensation for Rodolfo for every day that he has to go through life without his partner. For every day that he keeps his word to Lilia and to Carla and to Octavio and to Estrella. For every day that he stands by little Lillian and tries as hard as possible to give her as normal of a life as he can. How do you evaluate the pain and suffering of Carla? Lilia's firstborn daughter who saw her mother as her closest confidant. Carla recently became a mother herself and needed her mom during her pregnancy. She needs her mom now, but mom is gone. Carla was 15 years old the last time she said goodbye to her mother through that bathroom door. For Carla, for her pain and suffering and the loss of her mother's companionship in the past and the future, I'd suggest a verdict of $6 to $7 million. Again, you might think that's too high or too low, and it's up to you as a jury to figure out what that right number is and how to apportion that between the past and the future. We've heard about how Carla, in a panic, just started running down the hallways of the hospital and crashed through the double doors, after she found out what was going on with her mom. And how that she ran again, leaving Rodolfo and her siblings because it hurt too much to be in her mom's house without her mom there. Carla's still racked by the guilt that her little brother and her little sister, her baby sister and Rodolfo needed her, but she was so consumed with her own pain that she left. She feels like she caused them to suffer another loss, and that guilt haunts her. Her grades suffered for a while. Her credit suffered. She got pregnant. In some ways, that pregnancy saved her. It reminded her of the importance of family and how important it was to get herself together for her own child. But it also ripped open other wounds. Her mom wasn't there throughout her pregnancy. Going through childbirth obviously brought back the worst memories, the horrible thoughts of what happened to her mother. Now she sees things from a different perspective, and she needs her mother's help and guidance. You know, we hear about how each Mother's Day she can't open up her phone or open up her computer because she sees all her friends uploading pictures on social media. And even though she's now a mother and should be celebrating that, she can't enjoy that because her mom is gone. You know, how do you determine the damages suffered by Octavio, Lilia's only son, the one who is most attached to her? The self-described mama's boy who was the first one to jump up anytime she needed anything or everything. A boy who now feels that at this young age he needs to be strong for his family, but goes into his room so that he can break down crying into his pillow. Octavio was only 12 years old when he last heard his mother's voice. For Octavio, similarly, we'd suggest a range of $6 to $7 million. Octavio got on the stand yesterday and he poured his heart out. This little boy who saw his mom as his best friend. We heard about those early years in Georgia and those road trips to Tallahassee, and his joy at seeing his mom fall in love and finding a father. Not jealousy, joy. We heard about that long night when mom was at the hospital and he fell asleep outside of his grandfather's door on the floor because he was getting anxious. We heard the horror of how at 12 years old, upon losing his mom, he felt that it was his responsibility to comfort his sisters when he had also lost his mother. Each and every day he walks into that house and gets a stark reminder of what's missing. It's dark, it's quiet, it's lonely. No one's home, no food's cooking, no music is playing. More than anything though, Octavio misses his mom's company, her spirit, her smile. To this day, everything he does is to please his mother. How do we consider the damages suffered by Estrella? Lilia's little girl with a huge smile. The little soccer star who was the little ball of energy and was the baby of the family until Lillian came along. Estrella, who's still just 14 years old, is now constantly consumed with worry about her little sister. She was 10 years old the last time she got to taste her mother's cooking. Similarly, for Estrella, we'd suggest a range between $6 and $7 million. At 10 years old, her innocence was stripped from her. She talks about how she misses her mom on holidays and birthdays, but it's about more than that. It's about every moment that mom's not there. She told us yesterday that almost 4 years later, she hasn't found a way to tell most of her friends that her mom is gone. That when she meets new kids at school and they say, "Who did your hair?" she says, "My mom." Is that moving on? All Lilia Torres wanted for her children was a better life. Work hard, do well in school, become a success. She gave them love and she gave them confidence, and they still strive to please her even though she hasn't been here for almost 4 years. They still work hard, they still want to succeed, and they still want to make mom smile. Now, we've heard all this talk about how these kids have continued to succeed, and thank God they're good kids. Would this case be, would their grief be any more tragic if they had fallen off? Or if Rodolfo had quit on them? Of course not. They carry their mom with them, and they found a way to put one foot in front of the other and get through each day. But every single one of those days is a battle against grief and is a reminder of what's missing. When they walk in that house, the music has stopped. And then there's little Lillian, the baby girl that was supposed to be Deleza, but became Lillian when mom didn't make it out of that hospital room. As you heard, she's a happy little girl, and this little girl has no idea what was taken from her. The only thing she knows is dad doing her hair, is long days of waiting for dad to get off work and come pick her up. For Lillian, I'm going to suggest $3 million in the past and $7 million in the future. What Lillian lost is almost too painful for words. She was cheated out of the chance of ever having a mother, of ever knowing what an unconditional mother's love feels like. She's never heard that voice or felt mom's touch. She's never seen her smile or tasted her food. She got home from the hospital and didn't even know what wasn't there. She sat in that picture that we just looked at her baptism, and didn't even understand that there was someone else who's supposed to be in that picture. The only thing this little girl knows is being comforted by dad, being changed by dad, being fed by dad. How do you compensate someone who's almost 4 years old for their past loss of parental companionship, of parental guidance, of parental protection, when they never had mom from day one? Not to change one diaper, not to give one bottle. None of this was supposed to be that way. And you've also heard how the family worries about the future. Because one day, Lillian's going to grow up and realize that she doesn't have what every other kid has. She doesn't have a mom. She doesn't have a hero. She's going to understand that she never got to feel mom's hug or taste her food or hear her music. And then, of course, there's going to come the time when she realizes that mom died during her birth. And how's that going to affect her into her teenage years and as she gets older? That if my mom hadn't had me, she'd still be here. These are the thoughts that now mix in with all that love that's in that household. This picture is the...
5 minutes.
Thank you. This picture is the closest thing that Lilia Torres' family will ever have to a family picture, because she was pregnant with a baby at that point. When you consider the damages, this is all a part of what you're going to have to consider. And all of this pain and all this suffering occurred because of the negligence of those doctors. Their negligence didn't just cause a death. It did this harm to this family that through it all still worked so hard to make their wife and their mother proud. And yet, what did defense counsel say in opening? Everyone has picked up the slack. There's no picking up the slack for taking a man's wife. And there's no picking up the slack for taking a mother away from children. There's no picking up the slack for causing a little baby to never be able to meet the mother who carried her for 9 months. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Mr. Harwin and on behalf of the Torres family, I want to thank you for your time and for your attention. All I ask is that you consider the facts and evidence and apply the law and return a verdict that is just. I have no doubt that you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning again.